January 17, 1944. The South Pacific. A moonless night. The air above Rabaul hangs thick with humidity and the acrid smell of volcanic ash. In a cramped operations bunker carved into the limestone cliffs of New Britain, Captain Takeshi Yamamoto presses a crackling radio handset against his ear, sweat beating on his temple despite the evening cool. His voice cuts through static, coordinating fighter deployments with outlying bases across the Bismarck archipelago. Above him, invisible in the darkness, American bombers circle like patient predators. He does not yet know that every word he speaks is a beacon, that his own voice is painting coordinates for death written in high explosive and incendiary flame. Within 90 seconds, the bunker's entrance will erupt in white phosphorus, and Captain Yamamoto will understand, in his final conscious moments, that the war he thought he knew has transformed into something utterly alien. This was not supposed to happen. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the Pacific War with the most sophisticated naval communications network in Asia, a system born from decades of careful German technical advisement and refined through bloody lessons in China and Manchuria. Japanese radio operators trained for years, mastering not just Morse code and voice procedure, but the intricate art of signal discipline, frequency management, and encryption protocols that Tokyo's strategists believed rivaled anything the Western powers possessed. When Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had orchestrated the Pearl Harbor strike in December 1941, Japanese radio networks had operated with near-perfect coordination, maintaining communications security that left American intelligence analysts baffled and blind. The subsequent conquests across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands had only reinforced this confidence. Japanese commanders from Singapore to the Solomons communicated freely, coordinating complex operations across thousands of miles of ocean, secure in their conviction that American technology lagged years behind, that the enemy possessed neither the sophistication nor the industrial capacity to penetrate imperial communications networks. They were catastrophically wrong. What Captain Yamamoto and tens of thousands of Japanese military personnel did not understand, could not have understood given the rigid compartmentalization of Tokyo's military intelligence services, was that American scientists and engineers had inaugurated a revolution in electronic warfare that would fundamentally alter the nature of modern combat. The transformation had begun quietly, almost invisibly, in university laboratories and military research facilities scattered across the continental United States. At the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the radiation laboratory, established in October 1940, had become a crucible of microwave radar development, drawing together physicists, engineers, and mathematicians in an unprecedented collaboration. At Harvard University's Radio Research Laboratory, teams worked in sealed rooms developing radio countermeasures and direction-finding equipment. In New Jersey, Bell Telephone Laboratories channeled its vast commercial expertise into military applications, creating proximity fuses and airborne intercept systems. And in the Pacific Theater itself, hastily constructed listening stations on captured islands from Guadalcanal to New Guinea began weaving together a signals intelligence network of breathtaking scope and precision. By early 1944, this network had matured into a weapon unlike anything history had witnessed. American forces deployed high-frequency direction-finding systems, nicknamed Huff Duff by operators who monitored them, capable of triangulating enemy radio transmissions with startling accuracy. Multiple listening stations, positioned strategically across the Pacific, would simultaneously detect a Japanese transmission. Within seconds, operators calculated bearing lines, and where those lines intersected, coordinates materialized. These coordinates transferred to bomber crews, artillery batteries, or naval gunfire control centers with mechanical efficiency. The delay between a Japanese officer keying his radio and American ordnance arriving at his position had compressed to minutes, sometimes less. The electromagnetic spectrum itself had become a killing field. The Japanese military leadership understood radio direction finding in principle. Their own forces employed crude versions of the technology, and operational security protocols theoretically mandated strict limits on transmission duration and frequency. But theory collapsed under the crushing demands of combat reality. Japanese forces in 1944 found themselves scattered across an impossibly vast theater, isolated on hundreds of jungle islands, aboard ships operating beyond visual range of support vessels, in outposts connected to higher command only by the tenuous thread of radio communication. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy, products of a culture that prized hierarchy, discipline, and meticulous coordination, could not function without constant communication. Officers needed orders. commanders demanded status reports. Logistics required coordination. Intelligence flowed upward through elaborate chains of command. And so they transmitted, even as American direction-finding networks plotted every signal, even as bomber crews chalked coordinates onto mission boards, even as the invisible web of electromagnetic surveillance tightened around them. Captain Yamamoto represented a generation of Japanese officers who had internalized a particular vision of technological warfare. They had studied the Great War's lessons, had absorbed accounts of artillery direction by sound ranging and rudimentary signals intelligence. They understood that radio transmissions could theoretically be exploited. But understanding exists in the abstract, a chapter in a manual, a lecture at Staff College. Experience is visceral, immediate, undeniable. Japanese officers expected American attacks to follow observable patterns, concentrations of enemy forces, logical strategic objectives, reconnaissance-driven targeting. They expected warning, the drone of approaching aircraft, the escalating bark of anti-aircraft guns, time to seek shelter or disperse troops. They did not expect ordnance to arrive with supernatural prescience, to bracket their positions within seconds of completing a transmission, to demonstrate such intimate knowledge of their locations that survival seemed to require divine intervention rather than tactical skill. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura experienced this revelation on February 3, 1944, while coordinating a supply convoy near Wewak, New Guinea. His log, recovered from Japanese archives decades later, records the sequence with stunned precision. At 14:37 hours, he transmitted a routine status report to divisional headquarters, a transmission lasting approximately 90 seconds. At 14:41 hours, 4 minutes later, American B-25 Mitchell bombers appeared over the coastal road where his convoy waited. The attack lasted 7 minutes. Of 12 trucks, 11 burned. Of 47 men under his command, 19 died immediately, another 8 succumbed to wounds before nightfall. Lieutenant Nakamura survived because he had left the convoy to relieve himself behind a tree line seconds before the first bombs fell. In his log, he wrote a single line of stunned realization: "They heard me. They came because they heard me." The radio, that essential instrument of modern command and control, had transformed from tool to traitor. Across the Pacific theater, this pattern repeated with such consistency that even the most skeptical Japanese commanders could not deny the correlation. On Truk Lagoon, communications officers reported that American air raids intensified within hours of increased radio traffic. At Rabaul, a major signals intelligence center, noted that destroyer pickets making routine position reports suffered disproportionate submarine attacks. In the Philippines, Army units maintaining radio schedules with Tokyo experienced bombing runs that seemed impossibly well-timed. The evidence accumulated like water behind a dam, mounting pressure against official denials and institutional inertia. Japanese tactical doctrine, battle procedures, command structures, all had been architected around reliable communications. To acknowledge that radio transmissions had become death sentences demanded not just tactical adjustment, but conceptual revolution. Some units attempted adaptation. Radio silence protocols intensified. Transmission durations shortened to 30 seconds, 15 seconds, frantic bursts of compressed information. Operators changed frequencies constantly, hopping across the spectrum in patterns they prayed remained unpredictable. Elaborate codes replaced plain language, adding layers of complexity to already strained communications procedures. Decoy transmissions attempted to generate false targets, sacrificial signals meant to waste American ordnance. But these countermeasures prove inadequate against the sophistication and sheer scale of American signals intelligence. The Huff-Duff networks required only seconds to establish a bearing, and multiple stations cross-referenced those bearings faster than operators could cease transmission. Frequency changes meant nothing when listening stations monitored the entire usable spectrum simultaneously. Codes provided no protection against direction finding, which cared only about the transmission's origin, not its content. And decoy signals simply provided American analysts additional data points, refining their understanding of Japanese communications patterns and dispositions. The psychological toll proved as devastating as the physical casualties. Japanese military culture emphasized courage, discipline, acceptance of death in service to the emperor. Soldiers trained to face enemy fire, to conduct bayonet charges against machine gun nests, to pilot aircraft in suicide attacks against American fleet carriers. But this new form of warfare offered no opportunity for martial valor, no enemy to confront, no death to meet face forward with dignity intact. Radio operators began to dread their own equipment. Communications officers delayed transmissions, gambling that the delay might prove less costly than the risk of attracting American attention. Battalion commanders found themselves paralyzed, cut off from higher authority, unable to report their positions or request support without potentially signing death warrants for their entire commands. The radio handset itself became an object of superstitious terror, a cursed artifact that summoned destruction from the sky. Commander Saburo Ishikawa, a staff officer at Rabaul, recorded a conversation with a signals company commander that illuminated this psychological transformation. The signals officer, a career communications specialist named Tanaka, sat in Ishikawa's office in March 1944, hands trembling despite the tropical heat. Tanaka reported that his radio operators were experiencing what we might now recognize as acute anxiety responses, that some refused to transmit, that others wept before keying their sets. They believe the radio is haunted, Tanaka explained, his voice hollow. They say American demons live in the electromagnetic waves, listening always, waiting to devour whoever speaks. Ishikawa, a rational man educated in naval engineering at Tokyo Imperial University, initially dismissed this as superstition, weakness unbefitting imperial servicemen. But Tanaka leaned forward, his eyes reflecting something beyond fear, a kind of existential terror. Yesterday, we lost Sergeant Ono. He made a 5-second transmission to report battery failure. The Americans hit his position in less than 3 minutes. 5 seconds, Commander. How is this possible? What science permits such precision? This is not warfare as we understand it. This is something else. It was indeed something else. American forces had industrialized signal intelligence with the same ruthless efficiency they applied to every aspect of modern warfare. Where Japanese forces cobbled together countermeasures reactively, struggling with limited resources and inter-service rivalries, the United States military-industrial complex deployed integrated systems of staggering sophistication. Beyond direction finding, American cryptanalysts at Station HYPO in Hawaii and OP-20G in Washington had systematically penetrated Japanese naval codes, providing strategic intelligence that complemented tactical signals intelligence. American submarines carried radio intercept equipment, lurking near Japanese shipping lanes to identify and track convoy movements. Patrol aircraft mounted direction-finding receivers, extending the surveillance network across thousands of square miles. And coordinating this vast apparatus, radio centrals on Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and eventually the Philippines processed information with industrial efficiency, prioritizing targets, allocating strike resources, closing the loop between detection and destruction with ever-decreasing latency. The symbolic resonance of this technological superiority extended beyond mere tactical advantage. Japanese militarism had predicated itself on spiritual superiority, the Bushido ethos that discipline and sacrifice could overcome material disadvantage. The Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere promised liberation from Western colonialism, a new order built on Asian solidarity under Japanese guidance. Propaganda emphasized American decadence, the soft materialism of democratic society, the supposed weakness of individualistic culture against Japan's collective will. But here, in the electromagnetic spectrum, American technical and industrial superiority manifested with undeniable force. The nation Japanese propaganda dismissed as spiritually corrupt had mastered the invisible realm of radio waves with scientific sophistication that exposed Japanese capabilities as primitive by comparison. Every bomb that followed a radio signal carried a message beyond high explosive and shrapnel. It whispered of assembly lines and research laboratories, of universities and corporations mobilized for total war, of a productive capacity so vast it could afford to hunt individual soldiers across an ocean-spanning battlefield. The radio handset became the symbol of this disparity. A Japanese officer holding that device embodied a tragic paradox. To use it meant maintaining the communication networks essential to coordinated military operations, fulfilling duties demanded by rank and training. But to use it also meant offering oneself as a sacrifice, speaking one's own coordinates into existence, transforming from hunter to prey through the simple act of pressing the transmit key. The handset represented connection and isolation simultaneously, the promise of reaching across distance instantly, and the terrible certainty that death might answer. In the hands of Japanese officers across the Pacific, that device grew heavy with metaphorical weight, a totem of technological obsolescence, strategic delusion, and the slow, grinding collapse of imperial ambitions. By mid-1944, Japanese forces faced an impossible calculus. Radio silence preserved security but paralyzed operations. Communication enabled coordination but invited destruction. Some commanders attempted to split the difference, establishing elaborate systems of messengers, signal flags, even carrier pigeons to reduce radio dependence. But modern warfare's tempo rendered such methods obsolete. By the time a messenger delivered orders on foot across jungle terrain, tactical situations had evolved beyond recognition. Signal flags required visual line of sight, useless in the dense vegetation of Pacific Islands or across the vast spaces of naval operations. Carrier pigeons, a technology already anachronistic in 1944, fell prey to tropical storms, predators, and the simple chaos of combat environments. The Japanese military found itself trapped in a bind entirely of modernity's making, unable to function without technology that had been turned against it, unable to retreat to pre-technological alternatives that couldn't support contemporary operational tempo. American after-action reports from 1944 and 1945 document the success of this electronic warfare campaign with clinical precision. Naval intelligence summaries noted correlation rates above 90% between Japanese radio transmissions and subsequent successful air strikes. Marine Corps after-action reports from Saipan and Peleliu recorded instances of Japanese positions identified and neutralized within 15 minutes of radio activity. Army Air Force mission reports from the Philippines theater demonstrated systematic targeting of enemy headquarters elements, command posts identified through signals intelligence and destroyed before they could relocate. The statistics accumulated into a comprehensive portrait of electronic dominance, a one-sided battle fought in the electromagnetic spectrum where Japanese forces possessed neither adequate defenses nor effective countermeasures. But statistics, however compelling, fail to capture the human dimension of this revolution. For the individual Japanese soldier, sailor, or airman, the experience of electronic warfare manifested as something approaching supernatural persecution. Aircraft appeared as if summoned by magic. Artillery fire converged with impossible accuracy on positions that had seemed secure and concealed. Submarines materialized to torpedo convoys whose routes should have remained secret. In the absence of visible explanation, supernatural interpretations flourished. Radio operators spoke of American ghosts in the airwaves. Infantry companies developed superstitions about transmission times and frequencies. Officers consulted lucky charms and observed elaborate rituals before using communications equipment, as if spiritual protection might shield them from technological detection. Major Kenji Hatanaka, commanding an infantry battalion on Bougainville, recorded his observations in a diary that survived the war. Writing in August 1944, he described the disintegration of rational military operations under the pressure of invisible surveillance. We no longer dare to coordinate. Each company has become an island, isolated not by ocean, but by fear of the radio. I know American forces advance toward our positions, but I cannot call for reinforcements without potentially destroying those same reinforcements. Yesterday, Lieutenant Sato transmitted a request for medical supplies. American bombers struck the aid station 40 minutes later. 16 wounded men died in that attack, men who had survived combat only to be killed because we asked for bandages and morphine. How does one command under such conditions? What doctrine addresses this? I find myself paralyzed, unable to fulfill basic responsibilities of command because the tools of command have become weapons turned against us. This paralysis extended beyond tactical operations to strategic thinking. Japanese naval planners, confronting evidence of American signals intelligence penetration, faced terrible choices. The combined fleet required coordination across vast distances, submarines hunting in wolf packs, carrier strike groups operating in concert, surface action groups responding to developments in real time. All of this demanded radio communication. But every transmission potentially compromised operational security, feeding American intelligence networks information about fleet dispositions, movement patterns, operational intentions. The Imperial Navy could maintain communication security only by accepting operational paralysis, or maintain operational flexibility only by surrendering communications security. Japanese leadership, institutional momentum, tactical doctrine, all pushed toward continued radio use despite mounting evidence of catastrophic compromise. The alternative, genuine radio silence at operational scale, would have required wholesale restructuring of doctrine, tactics, and command relationships, transformations that exceeded the imperial military's capacity for adaptation while simultaneously fighting for survival across the Pacific. Technological disparity manifested in other domains. American radar increasingly dominated air combat, allowing fighters to intercept Japanese formations with devastating effectiveness. American submarines employed sophisticated fire control computers while Japanese counterparts relied on manual calculations. American logistics networks moved supplies with efficiency Japanese planners could scarcely imagine avalanches of material that sustained offensives across oceanic distances. But signals intelligence held unique psychological power because it transformed the enemy into an apparently omniscient presence, an all-seeing observer against whom concealment seemed impossible, distance provided no security, and secrecy offered no protection. Lieutenant Kazuo Sakamaki, who survived the war after spending years as a prisoner, described this psychological dimension in post-war interviews. "We learned to fear the radio more than we feared enemy soldiers," he recalled. "You could fight a soldier. You could see him, shoot at him, take cover from his fire. But the radio brought invisible death. You could not fight what you could not see, could not predict when or where it would strike. Some men preferred to risk court-martial rather than transmit. Others developed elaborate superstitions, refusing to use certain frequencies, believing specific times of day were safer. Our communications discipline, once a source of pride, collapsed into chaos driven by terror of invisible listeners who could summon destruction from the sky." By 1945, as American forces closed on the Japanese home islands, signals intelligence had become so sophisticated that Japanese transmissions were often decoded, translated, and acted upon faster than they moved through Japan's own command structure. American intelligence officers joked darkly that they understood Japanese operations better than Japanese commanders did. This was only slight exaggeration. The combination of broken codes, comprehensive direction finding, and traffic analysis provided American forces a level of battlefield transparency historically unprecedented. Japanese units moved under constant observation. Japanese plans were known before execution. Japanese communications became a liability so severe that some units effectively ceased radio operations entirely, accepting isolation as preferable to annihilation. The radio handset, that small device of bakelite and metal and electronic components, carried in a leather case or mounted in a vehicle or installed in a bunker, became the embodiment of technological obsolescence and strategic failure. It represented promises unkept, security illusory, the vast gap between what Japanese militarism had promised and what it could deliver. Every time a Japanese officer reached for that handset, every time fingers closed around its solid mass, a moment of existential calculation occurred. The weight of the device seemed to increase with knowledge, with accumulated evidence of its treachery, until lifting it to speak became an act of will against instinct, duty against self-preservation. And yet they transmitted. Despite the fear, despite the casualties, despite the mounting evidence that every broadcast potentially invited destruction, Japanese forces continued to use their radios because modern military operations offered no alternative. The coordination required to defend against American offensives, the logistics necessary to sustain forces across the Pacific, the command and control essential to any organized resistance, all demanded communication. Officers who understood the risks transmitted anyway because orders required it, because soldiers needed support, because the war continued regardless of technological disadvantage. The tragic heroism of these transmissions lay not in any tactical brilliance or strategic insight, but in simple persistence, the refusal to surrender functionality despite terror, the mechanical completion of duties in the face of apparently impossible odds. This persistence extracted a psychological price that survived the war. Veterans interviewed decades later still spoke of the radio with visceral unease, the trauma of technological warfare, leaving scars invisible but enduring. Some reported that even civilian radio use triggered anxiety responses, flashbacks to moments when speaking meant dying. Others described nightmares of transmitting endlessly while bombs fell closer, dreams where radio static carried the screaming of dying men. The electromagnetic spectrum, invisible and intangible, had become haunted by memory, frequency bands carrying not just information but trauma, the residue of technological terror encoded in the survivors' minds. The broader implications extended beyond individual psychology to historical understanding. Japan's Pacific War failures stem from multiple factors: industrial capacity, resource access, strategic overextension, tactical rigidity, but signals intelligence represented something qualitatively distinct. Where other American advantages manifested gradually, accumulating through attritional processes of production and logistics, electronic warfare superiority appeared sudden, inexplicable by Japanese understanding of the strategic situation. One month officers transmitted freely, the next month transmissions brought death. The rapidity of this transformation, the apparent impossibility of effective countermeasures, generated a sense of helplessness corrosive to morale and devastating to operational effectiveness. American forces, reading decrypted Japanese communications, watched this psychological disintegration with clinical interest. Intelligence reports noted increasing desperation in Japanese transmissions, growing references to difficulties and shortages, communications that revealed not just tactical information but emotional states. The Emperor's soldiers, trained to stoic endurance, began transmitting fear in barely coded language, calling not just for supplies and reinforcements, but for hope, for explanation, for some indication that resistance remained meaningful. American intelligence officers, translating these intercepts, sometimes paused at the human dimension revealed in desperate radio calls, the voices of men who understood they were losing but continued fighting because surrender remained culturally and militarily impossible. The endgame came with predictable inevitability. As American forces landed on Okinawa in April 1945, Japanese defenders found themselves in an impossible tactical situation, outnumbered, outgunned, and crucially, outcommunicated. The 32nd Army attempted to coordinate defensive operations across the island, to shift reserves and concentrate forces against American penetrations. But every radio transmission plotting these movements fed American intelligence. Every coordination attempt exposed defensive positions to air strikes and naval gunfire. General Mitsuru Ushijima, commanding the defense, effectively fought blind against an enemy that could see his every move, anticipate his responses, counter his tactics before they fully developed. Radio communications, that essential nervous system of modern armies, had been compromised so thoroughly that it actively impaired Japanese defensive capabilities. Ushijima eventually ordered severe radio restrictions, accepting operational paralysis as preferable to continued exposure. The 32nd Army fragmented into isolated pockets, communication reduced to runners carrying messages through bombardment and combat, coordination degraded to pre-industrial methods, while facing the most technologically advanced military force history had assembled. The outcome was never in doubt. When Japanese forces finally surrendered in August 1945, American signals intelligence personnel inventoried, captured communications equipment with professional interest. They examined Japanese radio sets, encryption devices, direction-finding equipment, assessing the enemy's capabilities with the detached curiosity of victorious technicians. The equipment proved adequate, sometimes even sophisticated in design, products of competent engineering and careful manufacture. But adequacy was not enough. Japanese communications technology lagged perhaps 5 years behind American equivalents, a gap that proved insurmountable in the compressed timeline of the Pacific War. More fundamentally, Japanese forces had never developed the integrated systems approach that characterized American electronic warfare, the coordination between signals intelligence, cryptanalysis, direction finding, and strike assets that transformed information into destruction with industrial efficiency. Individual components of Japanese signals technology functioned adequately. The system failed catastrophically. The radio handset endures as symbol and artifact, example of how technological disparity manifests in modern warfare, how tools meant to empower can become instruments of vulnerability, how the invisible realm of electromagnetic radiation can become as deadly as any physical battlefield. In museums and private collections, Japanese military radios sit silent now, inert objects behind glass or in storage, their frequencies empty, their circuits dormant. But for those who carry them, who pressed those transmit keys while knowing death might answer, who spoke coordinates and orders and desperate pleas into handsets that had become traitors, the radios remain weighted with terrible significance, symbols of a war fought not just with bullets and bombs, but with invisible forces that transformed the very nature of combat. The lesson transcends any particular conflict or nation. Technology empowers only until adversaries develop superior technology. Advantage persists only through continuous innovation and adaptation. Today's secure communication becomes tomorrow's fatal exposure. The electromagnetic spectrum, seemingly infinite in its capacity, proves as contested and dangerous as any physical terrain. And the tools we create to extend our capabilities can become instruments of our destruction when those capabilities are exceeded, when adversaries master the same tools with greater sophistication, when the very means of coordination and control become windows through which enemies observe our vulnerabilities and strike with precision previously impossible. On a deeper level, the radio's transformation from tool to trap speaks to the nature of modern technological warfare itself, where battles are won or lost in laboratories and factories as much as on battlefields, where scientific understanding translates directly into combat power, where the capacity to innovate and adapt determines survival regardless of courage or sacrifice. The Japanese officers who transmitted knowing the risks, who pressed those handset keys despite fear, who fulfilled their duties even as those duties became suicidal, deserve recognition not as fools or failures, but as men trapped in a technological revolution beyond their capacity to counter, victims of an asymmetry they could neither fully understand nor effectively resist. The radio handset weighs nothing now, a museum piece, a historical curiosity. But in January 1944, February, March, April, through the grinding months of defeat and retreat, that device grew heavier with accumulated knowledge, with evidence of its treachery, with the weight of men who had spoken and died, until lifting it required not just physical strength but moral courage, until keying the transmit button became an act of sacrifice as profound as any battlefield heroism. Those officers understood, finally and completely, that they had entered a new kind of warfare where the invisible mattered as much as the visible, where silence meant survival and speech meant death, where the tools of modernity had turned against them with mechanical indifference. And so they transmitted anyway, because duty demanded it, because their training required it, because modern war offered no alternative, speaking into handsets that had become gravestones, marking their positions with electromagnetic signatures that wrote their coordinates in the sky, calling down the thunder that followed radio signals through the invisible air, dying not in glorious battle, but in sudden fire that arrived impossibly fast, impossibly accurate, impossibly knowing. The radio had promised connection across distance, coordination across chaos, the triumph of communication over geography's limitations. It delivered instead a different truth, that in total war, every tool becomes a weapon, every strength conceals a weakness, and every transmission can be the last words spoken before the bombs arrive, following radio signals through the tropical night, finding their targets with the precision of mathematics and the inevitability of industrial death.